Cozy Tales Collective, where dreams begin and worries fade. Welcome, dear listener. It's time to rest, to let go of the day, and to embrace deep relaxation. Take a slow, deep breath in and exhale gently. Feel the weight of your body sink into your bed, as if you are floating on a soft, drifting cloud. Let the tension melt away. Your forehead softens, your shoulders relax, your breath slows. Now imagine yourself carried by a gentle breeze, drifting toward a peaceful night's sleep. Let your thoughts fade into the background as we begin our bedtime story. The Luminous Prophecy of Atlantis. Chapter 1: The Abyss Beckons. Dr. Lillian Carter adjusted her diving mask, the rhythmic sound of her breath echoing through the regulator. The submersible light cut through the deep-sea gloom, illuminating the jagged rock formations of the mid-Atlantic ridge. She had spent years searching for evidence of an ancient civilization lost beneath the waves, and tonight she was closer than ever. Her heart pounded as she followed the narrow crevice discovered by sonar scans. It shouldn't have been there. The ridge was already mapped, or so she had thought. But the coordinates she'd received from an anonymous sender a week ago had led her to this untouched chasm. As she squeezed through the passage, the ocean itself seemed to hush. A pressure shift signaled an opening ahead. Lillian adjusted her buoyancy and propelled herself forward. What she saw on the other side stole the breath from her lungs. A cavern, a massive air-filled cavern. She broke the surface, gasping in shock. Bioluminescent coral coated the walls in shifting hues of violet and emerald. The cavern was impossibly large, its domed ceiling arching high above her, defying everything she understood about underwater geology. Then she saw them. Books, hundreds of them, stacked neatly on stone pedestals, their covers shimmering like trapped moonlight. Lillian hauled herself onto a ledge, her wetsuit dripping onto the smooth, ancient floor. With trembling fingers, she reached for the nearest tome. The material felt like neither paper nor parchment. It was something else entirely. Something that pulsed faintly beneath her touch. She opened the book. The symbols inside glowed a soft blue, shifting like liquid, forming intricate spirals of meaning beyond human comprehension. The language of Atlantis. Her pulse thundered. If she could decipher these texts, she might finally prove the existence of the lost civilization. But as she ran her hand along the cover, a deep vibration rumbled through the cavern. A warning. The ocean was coming to reclaim its secrets. Lillian set up her waterproof notepad and voice recorder. She had to work fast. The books, though otherworldly, were fragile, some already disintegrating into glowing dust. She began sketching the symbols, cross-referencing them with known Atlantean inscriptions found in scattered ruins across the Mediterranean. A pattern emerged. One phrase repeated across multiple texts, Aena thalassa epistrativae. She murmured the words aloud, the syllables tasting electric on her tongue. The sea returns. Her breath hitched. Was this a prophecy? A warning? She turned another page, her fingers flying across the text. Images accompanied the script, Atlantean scholars standing before a grand city, its spires piercing the sky. Then a cataclysm, waves swallowing towers, earthquakes splitting the ground, and finally an exodus. Another phrase glowed beneath the illustration: Ta Biblia the Dun Ton Dromo. The books will show the way. A way to what? Salvation? Survival? Before she could turn the next page, the cavern shuddered violently. Cracks spiderwebbed across the stone. Seawater gushed from the fractures, hissing as it met the cavern's ancient air. Lillian grabbed another book, scanning desperately. The prophecy was unfinished. She had to find the rest before it was too late. The water surged higher, rising to her knees. Her fingers brushed across a pedestal, feeling an indentation beneath the book resting there. A mechanism? She pushed down. A deep chime resonated through the cavern, and the floor beneath her shifted. The bookshelves groaned as a hidden panel slid open in the far wall, revealing a doorway wreathed in golden light. Lillian hesitated only for a second before diving through. She stumbled into a smaller chamber, the walls covered in inscriptions. At its center stood a pedestal of black stone, holding a single book bound in silver and sapphire. It thrummed with energy, untouched by time. As she reached for it, a gust of air swept through the chamber. A voice, deep, resonant, and filled with sorrow, echoed in her mind. You have come for knowledge, but knowledge comes with a price. Lillian froze. The voice wasn't spoken aloud, yet she heard it as clearly as her own thoughts. Atlantis fell because we ignored the warnings. Now the cycle nears its end again. She swallowed. What warnings? The book before her flickered, its cover revealing an image of Earth from above, oceans swirling, storms raging. The sea reclaims what is forgotten. The waters rise. Your world is next. Lillian's blood ran cold. Climate change, the melting ice caps, rising sea levels. Had the Atlanteans faced the same fate? Had they foreseen the same disaster now threatening modern civilization? She turned the book's pages frantically. The last entries were rushed, desperate. Instructions, a way to stop it. Then the walls cracked. The golden light flickered. The cavern was collapsing. She had to get out. Clutching the silver-bound book to her chest, Lillian sprinted back through the doorway, nearly slipping as water gushed past her boots. The once air-filled cavern was now a swirling vortex. The luminous books, Atlantean knowledge, were dissolving into the tide. She dove into the water, kicking hard as the cavern walls crumbled. The narrow passage she'd come through was closing fast. With a final, desperate push, she squeezed through, feeling the jagged rocks scrape against her suit. Then she was free, back in the open ocean. The cavern behind her imploded, sending a shock wave that rattled her bones. She swam toward her submersible, lungs burning, heart hammering. As she sealed the hatch behind her, gasping for breath, she stared at the book in her hands. The last prophecy of Atlantis, and the key to humanity's future. Back on the research vessel, Lillian spread the book's pages across her desk, cross-referencing, translating, decoding. The Atlanteans had left behind knowledge, blueprints, equations, something resembling climate models. A warning, a solution. If she could decipher it, she could change the course of history. As she picked up her phone to call the scientific community, The silver-bound book pulsed softly beneath her fingertips. The voice from the cavern echoed once more in her mind. The choice is yours. Will you listen this time? Lillian took a deep breath, and then she began to write. Chapter 2: The Awakening. Dr. Lillian Carter sat hunched over the Atlantean book in her cramped cabin aboard the research vessel Oceanus, her fingers tracing the glowing script with fevered urgency. Hours had passed since she had escaped the collapsing cavern, but the adrenaline still burned in her veins. She had uncovered something earth-shattering, an ancient warning, perhaps even a solution to a catastrophe that loomed over the modern world. The ship rocked gently on the Atlantic's swells, but Lillian barely noticed. The silver-bound book pulsed softly, almost as if it were breathing, its energy shifting beneath her fingertips. The text, though still indecipherable in parts, was beginning to yield to her expertise. She had already translated fragments that spoke of the Great Cycle, a repeating catastrophe where the oceans rose to reclaim the land. According to the texts, Atlantis had not simply been swallowed by the sea. It had been forewarned, just as modern scientists now warned of climate disaster. But the most compelling part was what lay beyond the warnings. A possible salvation. Her satellite phone buzzed against the wooden desk. Jolting her from her thoughts, she snatched it up. "Dr. Carter?" A voice crackled on the other end. It was Dr. Elias Harrington, a historian and longtime skeptic of her work. "You've been off the grid for hours. You sent me those images. Are you seriously claiming they're from an undiscovered Atlantean site?" Lillian took a breath. She needed allies, not doubters. "Elias, listen to me. This isn't just a site. I found an entire library, the texts." She hesitated, glancing at the glowing script. "They're unlike anything we've ever seen." Elias scoffed. "Lillian, we've been over this. Atlantis is a myth. Plato's allegory, remember? You're risking your credibility chasing shadows." Her grip tightened on the phone. "Then how do you explain this?" She snapped a photo of the book, its luminous script casting an ethereal glow in the dim cabin, and sent it to him. There was silence. A long, breathless pause. "My God," Elias whispered. Lillian exhaled sharply. She had his attention. "Can you translate it?" he asked, his voice suddenly urgent. "Some of it," she admitted. "But Elias, it's not just a record of the past, it's a prophecy. And it might be a warning for our time." Another pause. Then, "Tell me everything." Lillian did. She recounted the discovery of the cavern, the books dissolving in the rising tide, the silver-bound tome and its message. As she spoke, the words from the unseen voice in the chamber echoed in her mind. "The choice is yours. Will you listen this time?" "I need to analyze the equations in this book," she continued. "They look like climate models, but the math is beyond anything I've seen." "I have a contact at MIT, Elias said. Dr. Nadira Patel. If these are real calculations, she can decode them." Lillian nodded, already snapping more photos. "I'll send them now, but Elias, this can't go public yet. If the world finds out what I've found before I understand it—" "I know," Elias said grimly. "This is bigger than both of us." She ended the call, her heart pounding. If what she suspected was true, she wasn't just holding history in her hands. She was holding a key to the future. But there was something else. A growing unease in her gut. She wasn't alone in this discovery. Someone had sent her those coordinates. Someone had known about the cavern, and if they had found it once, they could find it again. 3 days later, Lillian stood on the deck of Oceanus, watching as a helicopter approached from the east. The setting sun bathed the Atlantic in gold and crimson, but her mind was focused on what lay ahead. Dr. Nadira Patel stepped out of the chopper, her sharp eyes scanning the deck as she adjusted her glasses. A climate scientist and physicist specializing in predictive modeling, Nadira had spent her career warning the world about rising sea levels. Now she was about to uncover a warning far older than anyone had imagined. Lillian met her with a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming." Nadira nodded. "Elias told me everything. If these equations are real, they could change the way we understand climate science." Lillian led her into the cabin where the Atlantean book lay open beneath a UV lamp. Nadira hesitated as she stepped inside, her gaze fixed on the glowing symbols. "This," she whispered, "this can't be real." Lillian handed her a notebook filled with translations. "See for yourself." Nadira sat down, scanning the inscriptions, her fingers tracing the equations. Then suddenly she stiffened. "These numbers," she muttered. She flipped through the pages, her eyes narrowing. "Lillian, this isn't just a model for sea level rise, it's a projection." Lillian leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "This equation," Nadira pointed at a particular sequence, "is calculating ocean temperature fluctuations over millennia. And this," she gestured to another formula, "is a model for tipping points." Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. "Tipping points?" Nadira looked up, her expression grim. "The moment when climate shifts become irreversible. When the ice caps collapse entirely, when the currents that regulate the planet's temperature shut down." Lillian swallowed hard. "Do the equations give a date?" Nadira hesitated. Then she scribbled furiously on a notepad, running calculations, adjusting variables. Minutes passed in tense silence. Finally, she set the pen down. "If these equations are correct," she said quietly, "we don't have centuries. We have decades." A cold knot formed in Lillian's stomach. The Atlanteans had seen this coming. They had lived it. And now the cycle was repeating. She closed the book, the glow dimming beneath her touch. "We need to take this to the world," Nadira nodded. "We do. But there's something else." Lillian met her gaze. "What?" Nadira hesitated. "There's another part to these equations. A solution, something the Atlanteans tried." Hope flared in Lillian's chest. "A way to stop it?" Nadira frowned. "Maybe, but it's incomplete." She turned the book back to a particular page, tapping at a missing section of the text. "If this is the key, we need the rest of the data." Lillian's heart sank. The rest of the books, the ones lost in the flood. Unless... Her mind raced. The voice in the cavern had said, "The books will show the way." Had she missed something? Was there another repository of knowledge somewhere? Before she could voice her thoughts, an alarm blared across the ship. Lillian and Nadira shot to their feet. The crew's voices crackled over the intercom. "Unidentified vessel approaching, no response on radio." Lillian's blood ran cold. Someone else knew. She grabbed the book, clutching it tightly. If this knowledge fell into the wrong hands, if the world learned of Atlantis's secrets before they were ready, humanity's fate could be sealed. Nadira grabbed her arm. "Lillian, we need to go, now." Footsteps pounded on the deck above. Shadows loomed outside the cabin window. Lillian made a decision. She wouldn't let this discovery die in secrecy, but she also wouldn't let it be stolen. As the ship rocked under the weight of approaching figures, she turned to Nadira. "We have to finish the prophecy." Then, clutching the book to her chest, she ran. Chapter 3. The Pursuit. The deck of Oceanus shuddered under the weight of approaching footsteps. The alarm blared through the ship's intercom, its sharp wail slicing through the Atlantic night. Dr. Lillian Carter clutched the silver-bound Atlantean book to her chest, heart hammering. Whoever these people were, they weren't friendly, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. Dr. Nadira Patel grabbed Lillian's wrist. "We need to move. Now." Lillian hesitated only for a moment before bolting toward the back of the ship, ducking low beneath the glow of deck lights. The air smelled of salt and metal, and the distant crash of waves against the hull was nearly drowned out by the sound of voices. Unfamiliar voices. "Where is she?" A man barked, his voice clipped, authoritative. Lillian and Nadira exchanged a glance. This wasn't a random pirate attack. This was something far more deliberate. They reached the rear storage area, where spare diving gear and research equipment were kept. Nadira pressed a hand against the metal door, whispering, "If we stay on board, they'll find us. We need an exit." Lillian nodded, quickly scanning the shelves. There, a reinforced waterproof case. She stuffed the Atlantean book inside, sealing it tight. If she lost it to the ocean, she'd never forgive herself. The door behind them rattled. Footsteps pounded closer. Lillian grabbed a diving mask and turned to Nadira. "Do you trust me?" Nadira's eyes widened. "Absolutely not." "Great, then follow me." Lillian swung open a side hatch just as the storage door burst open. A flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, nearly catching them. "There!" someone shouted. No time. Lillian grabbed Nadira's hand and jumped. The cold of the Atlantic slammed into her body like a vice, stealing her breath. For a moment, panic clawed at her chest. Had she miscalculated? Then her lungs adjusted and instinct kicked in. She twisted in the water, spotting Nadira flailing just a few feet away. Too loud, too much movement. Lillian kicked forward, grabbed her arm, and signaled for her to go still. Above them, shadows crowded the ship's railing. A searchlight flickered across the waves. "Find them!" a voice growled. "They have the book." Lillian's stomach twisted. Whoever they weren't just after the discovery itself. They knew what the book was. She tapped Nadira's arm, pointing downward. They had no choice. They had to go deeper. With careful, measured kicks, they descended into the darkness. Lillian wasn't sure how long they drifted beneath the surface, suspended in the Atlantic's cold embrace. The light from Oceanus faded behind them, replaced by the endless black. She checked her dive watch. 3 minutes submerged dot. Not much longer before their lungs would start screaming for air. A dim glow flickered ahead. Lillian narrowed her eyes. It wasn't from Oceanus or their pursuers. It was coming from below. She reached out, motioning for Nadira to follow. The two of them kicked toward the strange luminescence, their bodies gliding through the depths. Then, through the murky water, Lillian saw it. A second cavern. Unlike the first, this one wasn't concealed by a narrow crevice. It was a vast chasm, its entrance ringed with glowing, coral-like structures. The bioluminescent light pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. This can't be a coincidence. Lillian pointed toward the entrance. Nadira hesitated, but after a second she nodded. Together they swam inside. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the water around them shifted. The pressure changed. The weight on Lillian's chest lifted slightly. A powerful current, almost unnatural in its precision, pushed them forward. And then, suddenly, air. They breached the surface inside an enormous underwater chamber, gasping for breath. The cavern stretched in all directions, its walls glimmering with cascading waterfalls that seemed to defy gravity, their streams flowing upward instead of down. Strange, floating orbs of light hovered near the ceiling, illuminating the space with an ethereal glow. Lillian pulled off her mask, her breath ragged. "What the hell is this?" Nadira coughed, treading water. "This shouldn't exist." They swam toward the nearest ledge, hauling themselves onto the smooth, crystalline surface. The ground beneath them hummed, vibrating gently under their weight. Then they saw them. More books. Dozens, hundreds, lining the walls in neat, undisturbed rows. Unlike the books in the first cavern, these were untouched by time. Their covers shimmered in gold, silver, and obsidian, each pulsing softly as if alive. Lillian's chest tightened. This is what the prophecy meant. The books will show the way. She reached out, her fingers grazing the nearest tome. The moment she made contact, the cavern responded. The ground pulsed, the air crackled, the floating orbs of light shifted, converging toward a single point in the center of the chamber. A figure began to materialize. Lillian and Nadira staggered back, eyes wide. The figure was translucent, its form flickering like a reflection on water. Though its features were indistinct, there was no doubt in Lillian's mind. This was an Atlantean. The figure raised an arm, its voice reverberating through the chamber, both spoken and felt within their minds. "You have come seeking answers." Lillian swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The Atlantean's form pulsed. "We were the keepers of the knowledge, the last scribes of the great city. We left behind the warnings, but they were ignored, just as they are ignored now." Nadira exhaled sharply. "Then it's true. The cycle is repeating." The figure inclined its head. "The waters rise again, but this time there is still a choice." Lillian tightened her grip on the Atlantean book. "The equations, they show a solution, but they're incomplete." The figure's gaze, if it had eyes, locked onto hers. "Because the answer does not lie in numbers alone. It lies in what was lost." Nadira frowned. "What do you mean?" The cavern trembled. The orbs of light swirled faster. The books on the shelves flickered, pages rustling as if caught in an invisible wind. Atlantis did not perish in ignorance. We sought a way to halt the tides, to turn back the currents of destruction. And we succeeded. For a time. Lillian's pulse raced. Then what happened? The Atlantean's form wavered. We were betrayed. A chill ran through Lillian's body. By who? The cavern darkened. The book's glow dimmed. By those who wished to control rather than save. A sound echoed through the chamber, distant, rhythmic. Lillian's eyes widened. Footsteps. Their pursuers had found them. The Atlantean's form flickered. The choice remains. The knowledge must not fall again. Lillian turned to Nadira. We need to go. Nadira hesitated, glancing at the vast repository of books. We can't take all of this. We don't need to. Lillian grabbed a smaller, silver-bound tome from the nearest shelf, slipping it into her waterproof case. We just need enough to finish the prophecy. The footsteps grew closer. Shadows loomed at the entrance of the cavern. Lillian turned back to the Atlantean figure, desperation rising in her throat. How do we stop it? The Atlantean's form pulsed one last time. Find the one who betrayed us. Then, in a final burst of blinding light, the figure vanished. A gunshot rang out. The sound cracked through the cavern like a thunderclap. Lillian grabbed Nadira's wrist. Run! Clutching the books that could change the fate of the world, they plunged back into the water, just as the first bullet struck the ground behind them. Chapter 4. The Betrayer. A gunshot shattered the eerie silence of the cavern. The bullet ricocheted off the smooth, crystalline floor, sending shards of glowing dust into the air. Lillian didn't hesitate. She grabbed Nadira's arm and yanked her toward the water. Go! Now! They dove just as another shot rang out, piercing the space where they had stood moments before. Cold Atlantic water swallowed them, muffling the sound of their pursuers as they plunged into the abyss. Lillian kicked hard, gripping the waterproof case that contained the Atlantean books. If she lost it now, everything they had discovered, the equations, the prophecy, the warnings, would be gone. Darkness enveloped them as they swam deeper, away from the light of the cavern. Lillian's lungs burned, her body screaming for air, but she didn't dare surface yet. They had no idea how many were hunting them. A shadow passed overhead. Lillian's stomach clenched. A diver. They were being followed. She reached out in the dark, finding Nadira's wrist, and squeezed twice. A signal to keep going, keep pushing forward. The glow of the cavern entrance faded behind them, replaced by the endless black of the ocean depths. Finally, when her lungs felt like they might explode, Lillian risked a slow ascent. They broke the surface, gasping for breath. The Oceanus was gone. Lillian spun in the water, heart pounding. The research vessel was nowhere in sight. Either it had been taken or forced to flee. Nadira coughed, wiping seawater from her face. Now what? Lillian's mind raced. They had no ship, no immediate way to escape, and unknown enemies hunting them. The odds were stacked against them, but they still had the book. She clutched the waterproof case. We keep moving, we head east. There's a research station about 10 miles from here. Nadira grimaced. 10 miles? Through open water? It's our only option. Before Nadira could respond, a mechanical whir echoed through the night. A drone. Lillian whipped her head toward the sound and spotted a black quadcopter hovering above the waves, a blinking red light mounted beneath it. It wasn't searching. It had already found them. A spotlight blazed to life, cutting through the darkness and locking onto them. Then came the motorized roar of a speedboat. Lillian's pulse spiked. Dive! She and Nadira plunged beneath the waves just as bullets ripped into the water around them. The pressure shifts sent violent ripples through the sea, but Lillian kept swimming, moving deeper, moving fast. Through the gloom, she saw a shape, a coral overhang, just large enough for them to slip beneath. She grabbed Nadira's wrist, guiding them toward the natural cover. They squeezed into the tight space, pressing against the rock as the sound of the boat's motor approached. Then, silence. Lillian held her breath. The boat idled just above them. Through the water, she could hear voices. They have the book. A man's voice. Deep, controlled, not panicked, not guessing. He knew. Another voice, this one sharper. We need them alive. A pause, then. The employer says dead is fine, too. Lillian's blood ran cold. Whoever these people were, they weren't just mercenaries. They were working for someone who wanted this knowledge buried. The boat's engine roared back to life. Lillian stayed completely still as the sound faded into the distance. Only when she was sure they were alone did she slowly let out her breath, bubbles drifting toward the surface. Nadira met her gaze, eyes wide. They weren't safe yet. Not even close. By dawn, they had drifted miles east, riding the slow current toward the coordinates Lillian had memorized for a remote oceanic research station. They were exhausted, battered, and running on pure adrenaline, but the sight of the small white structure floating on the horizon sent a surge of hope through Lillian's chest. They swam toward the docking ladder, hauling themselves onto the platform, lungs heaving. The station was unmanned, only used for collecting atmospheric and oceanic data. Nadira collapsed onto the deck. If we live through this, I'm quitting science and becoming a baker. Lillian managed a breathless chuckle. You'd be bored in a week. Nadira groaned. Yeah, probably. Lillian pulled the waterproof case onto her lap and unlatched it. The silver-bound book was still intact, its symbols glowing softly in the dim morning light. We need to finish translating this, she said. Fast. Nadira sat up, still catching her breath. Even if we figure out what the Atlanteans did to stop the disaster, we don't have the technology they had. Lillian hesitated. Maybe we don't, but someone else might. She reached into her wetsuit pocket and pulled out her satellite phone. It was soaked, but still functional. She scrolled through her contacts, fingers shaking, until she found a number she hadn't called in years. Nadira glanced over. Who are you calling? Lillian hesitated, then hit dial. The phone rang twice. Then a familiar voice answered. Lillian Carter. Never thought I'd hear from you again. Lillian exhaled sharply. Neither did I, but I need your help, Declan. A chuckle. You mean the same Declan you told the National Science Council was a reckless idiot with no respect for protocol? Yeah, Lillian muttered. That one. Declan Hawthorne had once been one of the brightest minds in geoengineering, a scientist obsessed with terraforming solutions for rising sea levels. But he had been brilliant, unpredictable, and, most importantly, dangerous. His radical proposals had gotten him blacklisted from the scientific community. And now he might be the only person who could help. There was a pause. Then Declan's voice turned serious. "You wouldn't be calling me unless it was something big. What is it?" Lillian swallowed. "I found Atlantis." Silence. Then, "Okay, I'm listening." Lillian quickly explained everything. The cavern, the books, the prophecy, and the equations Nadira had partially translated. Declan let out a low whistle. "You're telling me an ancient civilization not only predicted modern climate collapse, but they solved it?" "I think so," Lillian said. "But we need your help finishing the calculations." Another pause. Then Declan said, "Where are you?" Lillian glanced at Nadira. "An unmanned ocean station in the Atlantic, but we're not safe." Declan sighed. "Well, lucky for you, I still have friends who owe me favors. Sending a boat your way?" Relief flooded Lillian's chest. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Declan said. "Just make sure you're still breathing when I get there." The line went dead. Nadira exhaled. "Well, that's one problem solved." Lillian frowned. "No, the biggest problem is still unanswered." Nadira glanced at her. "The missing part of the prophecy?" Lillian shook her head. "No, who betrayed Atlantis?" Nadira rubbed her temples. "You really think that matters?" Lillian stared at the glowing book. "The Atlantean said the betrayer stopped them from saving the world." She met Nadira's gaze. "What if it's happening again?" Nadira stiffened. A deep chill settled in Lillian's bones. Someone had tried to kill them, someone with power, money, and knowledge. The same kind of person who might have ensured Atlantis's downfall. Before she could say another word, the station's security alarm blared. Nadira jumped to her feet. "You've got to be kidding me." Lillian's stomach dropped. She ran to the edge of the platform. A black speedboat was racing toward them, and standing at the helm was Elias Harrington. Lillian's blood turned to ice. Her oldest friend, her strongest skeptic, and possibly the modern-day betrayer of Atlantis. Chapter 5: The Reckoning. The cold Atlantic waters swallowed Lillian Carter and Nadira Patel as they dove, bullets slicing through the surface above them. Their pursuers had found them, but they wouldn't get the book. Lillian clutched the waterproof case against her chest as she kicked hard, pushing deeper into the cavern's swirling current. Nadira was right beside her, swimming with powerful strokes despite the crushing exhaustion in her limbs. Above them, shadowed figures lined the cavern's rocky ledge, their flashlights cutting through the water like searchlights. Lillian's lungs burned, screaming for oxygen. She grabbed Nadira's arm and pointed toward a jagged tunnel in the rock, a second exit. Without hesitation, they pushed forward. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. The weight of the ocean pressed in from all sides. The moment they entered, the water shifted, pulling them forward with unnatural force. It wasn't just a current. It was something else, something guiding them. Lillian barely had time to think before the tunnel spit them out into the open sea, away from the cavern's entrance. The research vessel Oceanus bobbed in the distance, its lights dim under the cloudy sky. They had a chance, if they could just make it back. They broke the surface, gasping for breath. Nadira ripped off her mask, coughing. "I am never doing that again." Lillian barely had time to respond before the gunfire started again. A speedboat was cutting through the waves toward them, its dark hull nearly invisible against the black ocean. Armed men. Whoever these people were, they weren't giving up. Lillian's mind raced. "We have to reach Oceanus before they do." Nadira's gaze darted toward the ship. "We'll never make it swimming." Lillian scanned the water, then spotted something. An abandoned dive scooter. It must have been left by one of the intruders when they entered the cavern. She swam toward it, fingers fumbling with the controls. It still had power. "Get on!" she shouted. Nadira grabbed hold just as Lillian squeezed the trigger. The scooter roared to life, propelling them forward in a burst of speed. The wind whipped past them as they skimmed the water's surface, the speedboat gaining fast. Shouts echoed across the waves. A bullet struck the water just feet away. Too close. They weren't going to make it. Lillian's mind snapped into focus. If we can't outrun them, we have to outmaneuver them. She yanked the scooter hard to the left, aiming for the research vessel's rear ladder. The turn was abrupt, violent, nearly throwing them off. The speedboat overshot, its driver caught off guard. "Now!" Lillian yelled. Nadira was first up the ladder, scrambling over the railing. Lillian followed, her body slick with seawater. The moment her feet hit the deck, she screamed, "Go! Move!" The ship's captain, a grizzled former Navy officer named Ramirez, didn't hesitate. The Oceanus's engines roared to life, churning against the waves. The speedboat's driver tried to turn back, but they were too late. The Oceanus surged forward, the wake rocking the smaller boat violently. It veered sideways, losing control. The ship's crew scrambled into position. Armed, ready. A single warning shot cracked through the air. The speedboat's driver hesitated, then cursed and spun the vessel around, retreating into the night. Lillian collapsed against the railing, gasping. They had made it. For now. They locked themselves in the ship's research lab. The silver-bound book, still sealed in its waterproof case, sat on the desk between them. Nadira rubbed her temples. Who the hell were they? Lillian exhaled. I don't know. But they knew about the book. About Atlantis. And they didn't want us to have it. Nadira frowned. Then we need to find out who they are. And why. Lillian nodded, flipping the book open. The Atlantean text shimmered under the lab's fluorescent light. The words from the spectral figure in the cavern echoed in her mind. Find the one who betrayed us. She turned the pages carefully, scanning the glowing inscriptions. The book wasn't just a collection of history. It was a record of the fall. The final days of Atlantis. The desperate attempts to stop the rising tides, the betrayal that sealed their fate. Then she saw it. A name. Lillian inhaled sharply. Oh my God. Nadira leaned over. What? What is it? Lillian's hands trembled as she pointed to the Atlantean script. It's a name, the one who betrayed them. Nadira's brow furrowed. Can you translate it? Lillian swallowed hard. The name was ancient, but its meaning was clear. The Order of Poseidon. Nadira froze. That's impossible. Lillian looked up. You've heard of it? Nadira hesitated, then nodded. It's an old conspiracy theory. A secret society that supposedly dates back thousands of years. Some say they descend from the Atlanteans themselves, but most historians dismiss it as a myth. Lillian's stomach churned. What if it isn't? Nadira stared at her. You think those guys who attacked us were part of the Order, Lillian finished, and they don't want this knowledge getting out, because it proves that their ancestors knew what was coming, that they might have even caused it. Nadira ran a hand through her wet hair. If they've been hiding this for centuries, why now? Why come after us? Lillian's pulse quickened. Because we found the missing piece, the last book, and if I'm right, she turned the page. It holds the key to stopping the cycle. They worked through the night, deciphering the final passages. The Atlanteans had developed a method to slow the ocean's rise, a way to balance the Earth's fragile systems. But their solution had required something drastic. A reset. Lillian's breath hitched. This can't be right. Nadira's eyes widened as she read over her shoulder. They created a failsafe, something that could disrupt the climate shifts before they reached the tipping point. But it wasn't finished, Lillian whispered, because of the betrayal. The final passage burned in her mind. The Atlanteans had been on the verge of activating their solution when the Order intervened. The knowledge had been hidden, and over the centuries the world had forgotten. But now the knowledge was in their hands. A decision had to be made. Dawn broke over the Atlantic. Lillian stood at the ship's bow, the silver-bound book held tightly in her hands. Nadira joined her, arms crossed. So, she said quietly, what now? Lillian exhaled. We take this public. Nadira glanced at her. You really think the world will listen? Lillian turned to her, eyes blazing. They have to. A long pause. Then Nadira nodded. Behind them, the research team worked tirelessly, transmitting the book's contents to trusted scientists, universities, and journalists. The Order of Poseidon had tried to silence the truth for millennia. Not anymore. The knowledge of Atlantis, of its warnings, of its unfinished solution, it belonged to the world now. Lillian watched the horizon, the waves stretching endlessly before her. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The knowledge had been found. Now the real battle began. Would humanity listen this time? As the sun climbed higher, she made a silent vow. She would make sure they did. And for the first time in centuries, Atlantis would not be forgotten.